Passage 1. Let me first summarize the passage for you before we look at the questions. There is a recurrent theme in American history. This passage is about the Supreme Court verdict, which was on affirmative action, and the author's views on it. There's a recurrent theme in American history, the clawing back of hard-won progress. So what does he say? That Americans don't seem to be liking progress. They seem to claw it back. They want to push it back. The Supreme Court last week used the most specious of arguments. What's a specious argument? An argument that looks logical but is actually not logical. A false, something which is deceptive and not correct. That's called a specious argument. The Supreme Court last week used the most specious of arguments to do so with affirmative action. So what's the author saying? The Supreme Court took the country back. It clawed back the progress that the country had taken. It set America backwards with this decision on affirmative action. And what was the decision? In the majority opinion, the Chief Justice wrote that affirmative action, in this case, the use of race as a factor in university admission. So, the Supreme Court gave a verdict on should race be a factor in granting university admissions. And the Supreme Court said that it cannot stand. Affirmative action cannot stand because eliminating racial discrimination means eliminating all of it. So by Supreme Court implies that affirmative action is also a form of racial discrimination. So eliminate racial discrimination means eliminate race altogether. But of course, neither the court nor America itself has any desire to eliminate all of it. This is the author's comment. When the court was what the court was really signaling was that it intended to let racial imbalances born of both historical and current injustice be locked in and go unchecked. So the author has made a very huge, he's made a huge statement here. He said with its decision on affirmative action, what the Supreme Court has done is that it intended to let the racial imbalances continue as it is. It continue and to go unchecked. All right. Next para. Why does the author make such a huge statement against the Supreme Court decision? Affirmative action, however imperfect, is at least an acknowledgement of racialized imbalance and injury and an attempt to lessen their effects. This is what the author says. He says affirmative action may be imperfect, but at least it's an acknowledgement that there is racial imbalance, there is racial injustice in society, and affirmative action aims to lessen the effects of racial imbalances and racial injury. The court with its decision was washing its hands of racial discrimination that is not overt, conscious and codified. So it is actually saying, listen, when racial discrimination is open, conscious, codified, it will take action. But if it is not overt, conscious or codified, it had nothing to do with it. Knowing fully well, and the court has given this decision according to the author, knowing fully well that American racism, having evolved into more elegant forms for centuries, no longer requires articulated animus in order to be brutally effective. It doesn't need the racial hatred, injustice, injury to be articulated, to be expressed. It can be equally effective, brutally effective, without expressing it openly or overtly. Then he gives an example how this has happened. Enslavement evolved into convict leasing. First there was slavery, enslavement, that evolved into convict leasing. You lease convicts to do some work. And then to mass incarceration, imprisoning en masse. Whom? Racially, the people of color. Lynching evolved into a racially skewed death penalty apparatus. So earlier in acts of racial violence, people of color, generally black Americans, were lynched, were killed. But then he says that has evolved into a death penalty apparatus. The maximum number of people who were imprisoned, who are there in American jails, are African people, black Americans. And even the death penalty, maximum people who are awarded the death, because they are, a lot of violence is attributed to them. And according to the author, this is because of the flawed legal system. This is because of the flawed death penalty apparatus. Poll tests and literacy tests have evolved into racial gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is to manipulate things in your favor against a particular opponent. Voter ID requirements and restrictions on the date, time, and method of voting. So in every way, people of there is racial discrimination. In the death penalty apparatus, in poll tests, in literacy tests, voter ID, everything is skewed so that there is racial discrimination. It need not be overt, it need not be openly expressed. The evolved forms may not be as blunt as the ancestral ones. Earlier there was open racial violence. Now it has evolved. This discrimination has evolved. It may not be as open, as blunt, but they do keep the spirit and in many cases the actuality of racial imbalance and oppression very much alive. Even in its evolved form, racial imbalance, racial oppression is alive in America. So another big statement made by the author. Citing an older case, Roberts wrote, when a university admits students on the basis of race, it engages in the offensive and demeaning assumption that students of a particular race, because of their race, think alike. He says, when you offer admissions on race basis, you are actually discriminating because you are making the assumption that a particular race of people thinks in a particular way, which is wrong. This is according to the judge of the Supreme Court. But the author says this argument is also a fallacy. How? Race is meaningless, true, but living in a society where racism is rampant and chronic, a society in which you have, by virtue of race, had to navigate that racism has meaning, have to navigate that racism has meaning. Racism by itself is meaningless. Why should you differentiate on the basis of race? So it's meaningless. But when it's rampant in a society, when it's chronic, long-standing in a society, people of a particular race have to navigate that racism. Then race has meaning, because society gives meaning to race. While actually there is no basis for discriminating people on the basis of race. Racism is meaningless in that sense. When it's prevalent in society, it gets meaning. In 1954, the court offered its opinion in Brown versus Board of Education. And what did it say? To separate them of similar from others of similar age and qualifications solely on the basis of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect the heart and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone. So when there is racial discrimination in education, what happens is it generates a feeling of inferiority in the people who are discriminated against. And these feelings cannot be undone easily. The injury that you do by discriminating on the basis of race cannot be undone. That feeling of inferiority cannot be easily undone. The author says, beyond that, the psychological ramifications flow not only from how one feels about how one is viewed, but from the inequity, the injustice produced by the greater ability of some families to accrue and transfer wealth, in material harms produced by the increased likelihood of discrimination in employment, banking, healthcare, and the criminal justice system, from discriminatory urban planning and the under-resourcing of particular schools. So he says, but what happens is, it's not just the feeling of inferiority, it also has very tangible effects. What are these effects? Certain communities, certain race of people obviously have advantages of wealth, and that transfers from generation to generation. They collect and they transfer the wealth. And there is also other material harms that you face. if you are from a race that is discriminated against, you are discriminated in terms of employment, banking, healthcare, criminal justice system, even in urban planning and in schools. There is discrimination. So these are the effects that you can see of racism. Attitudinal changes a little more than feel-good figurative gestures. It's okay to say that you get rid of this admission on the basis of race. People should not think of race at all. Race is meaningless. There should be no idea of race. That attitudinal change is good. It's a feel-good expression. But it's like trying to solve global warming by individually recycling your grocery bags and buying organic bananas. The effect of attitudinal changes is similar to individual recycling to save the planet. Right? Now, so what will work? What will work to eliminate race? The author says, only structural disruptive changes can truly make a difference. That is where America balks. That is where America hesitates to make these huge structural disruptive changes. The court takes the absurd position that racism must be ignored for racism to be overcome. So what's the Supreme Court's view? You should ignore racism. You should to overcome racism, you should not take race into consideration. So you should ignore racism as if race doesn't exist. But that view does not control racism, does not put racism on a leash. Rather, it grants it license. There is more racism if this attitude is taken. All right, let's look at, this is the passage. I've read it, I've summarized it, explained it. Now let's look at the questions. A fundamental conclusion of the author is that, what is the fundamental conclusion? You read the entire passage. Which of these is the main conclusion of the author? Clawing back of progress is a common occurrence in America. Is that the main conclusion? He did say that Americans seem to have a history of clawing back progress, right? But that does not seem it's a common history. That's not the main point. The Supreme Court is behind the curve with respect to affirmative action. What does that mean? Behind the curve means lagging behind. He says the Supreme Court is wrong because it says that affirmative action is not justified. To discriminate race, there should be no race at all in college admissions, right? So no affirmative action. So this does not, it's not just behind the curve. Its whole logic about affirmative action and not having admissions on the basis of race is wrong according to the author. So B is not correct. The US Supreme Court's attitude and approach to racism is flawed. It is incorrect. There are big discrepancies in it, which the author has pointed out in the course of the passage. So C is my correct answer. Next question. The author states that attitudinal changes are little more than feel-good figurative gestures. He says nothing. They are like just some feel-good gestures, lip service they call it. Just something you're doing so people around you feel good. Which one of the following statements, if true, does not contradict this statement? So which of these statements aligns with the fact that attitudinal changes are not really effective? They are only feel-good figurative gestures. They're not effective in bringing about any change, right? Societal norms are stronger than legal rules and regulations. Now, if societal norms are stronger than legal rules and regulations, then attitudinal changes will be important. They will not be figurative expressions. So this contradicts the author's statement that attitudinal changes are only figurative expressions that make you feel good. They don't have any other purpose or effect. Laws are a concrete form of societal attitudes and norms. This also contradicts the author's passage because it says attitude is what finally materializes or becomes concrete in the form of laws. So attitudinal change will bring about a change in law. So attitudinal changes are important. That's what the sentence says, which is not what the author says. So B is also incorrect. Societal attitudes can exert a powerful influence on laws. Now, if they did that, if societal attitudes exert a powerful influence on law. In that case, attitudinal changes will result in legal changes, will result in a change in attitude and change in the laws and change in the entire structure which is against racism. So C also doesn't work. That means we left with one option. Let's look at it. Attitudinal change needs legal support to be effective. So attitudinal change by itself is not effective. It needs to be backed by legal support, other support to be effective. It by itself is ineffective. So that goes in line with what the author is saying. Therefore, the correct answer is D. Which of the following is not a valid inference from the passage? That means three options can be inferred and one either goes against the passage or is out of scope of the passage. So let's identify the one that cannot be inferred. The recent US Supreme Court action on affirmative action is flawed and deceptive. Yes, that is the main point of the author, so we can infer this. After all, the author criticizes the Supreme Court decision, showing all the mistakes, showing all the flaws in the Supreme Court's reasoning, right? So we can infer that the Supreme Court's, from the author's point of view, it is flawed. The Supreme Court of the United States openly supports and encourages racism. Now, the author didn't say that. He says, with this ruling, it shows that it wants to keep racism as it is. But the society in which US is now doesn't need open, overt acts of racism. It has evolved into a subtle form where racism is happening. So the author has at no point said that it openly supports and encourages racism. It says that to overcome racism, one should ignore racism, but that attitude is wrong. So you cannot infer option B. Therefore, option B is the correct answer. Clear? Question 4. Which of the following options best explains the following line? So read the line, simplify it in your own words, and then look at an option which will go in line with the answer that you have formed by simplifying the sentence. The evolved forms may not be as blunt as the ancestral ones, but they do keep the spirit and in many cases the actuality of racial imbalance and oppression very much alive. So evolved forms are not as open, as blunt, as brusque as the racism that existed earlier during the time of our ancestors. Still, in actuality, racial imbalance and oppression is actually kept alive even by the evolved form of racism. It has changed. The shape and structure and expression of racism has changed, but racial oppression and imbalance is very much kept alive, right? That's what we say. Let's look at the options. So which one goes in line or which one explains the statement best? Racism is more blatant and blunt than ever before. No. He says it has become more evolved. It is not as blunt as before. So this contradicts the passage. Racism is still practiced, but in a more subtle manner than ever before. Evolved form may not be as blunt, but it keeps racism alive. So maybe in a more subtle way, not in an open way. Goes in line with what the author says. But let's look at an option and see if we can get something better than this. Racial imbalance and oppression cannot be eliminated from society. He didn't say that. He said with the Supreme Court's attitude, racism is going to continue. But that doesn't mean he implies or says that it cannot be kept, cannot be eradicated. Moreover, the statement doesn't say that. The statement only says the evolved forms of racism are not as blunt as the ones earlier, but they still keep racial oppression alive, right? So C is not a description, not an explanation of that statement. The remnants of racism still exist and need to be eradicated. There's nothing said about that. He's only talking about the present form of racism, different from the earlier one. So racism is still practiced, it still exists, oppression still exists, injustice still exists, but in a different form. It's expressed in a more subtle manner, not as blunt or open as before. So the correct answer therefore is B.